Welcome back. Tonight we are not following one story. Tonight we are wandering through the shadows of the entire ninja world, the wars that shaped it, the villages that broke their own children to survive, the clans that destroyed themselves from the inside. This is the darkest lore the world of Naruto has to offer, gathered into one long, quiet journey. Let your body settle, let your eyes close, if they want to. You do not need to follow every detail. Just let the story wash over you. This is the darkest lore of Naruto to fall asleep to. Let us begin where so much of the world's pain began, the era before peace existed at all. Long before the hidden villages were built, the world was nothing but scattered clans, constantly at war with each other. There was no Hokage, no system of alliances or treaties, just families with powerful bloodlines fighting endlessly over land, over pride, over grudges that stretched back so many generations that no one even remembered how they started anymore. Children were taught to kill before they were taught to read. A boy might be handed a kunai before he was even given a proper toy. Clans like the Senju and the Uchiha grew their strength, not through peace, but through loss. Every battle hardened them. Every death pushed them to train harder, to awaken new powers, to become less like people and more like weapons. It was in this world that two boys met by a riverbank. One was Hashirama Senju, the other was Madara Uchiha. They did not know each other's last names at first. They were just children skipping stones, talking about a future where kids like them did not have to fight wars they never asked for. They imagined a place where children from every clan could grow up together, where the killing could stop. When they learned the truth of who they were, that their families were sworn enemies, something in that friendship cracked. It never fully shattered, but it changed. They would go on to build the foundation of what eventually became Konohagakure, the hidden leaf village. Their dream, twisted and complicated as it became, was the first real attempt to end the era of constant war. But peace, as the world would learn again and again, never comes without cost. Madara grew suspicious that his own clan was being slowly pushed aside, treated as lesser within the very village he helped build. He believed the Uchiha were given the most dangerous duties, while the Senju received the glory. Some of this suspicion was paranoia, some of it, painfully, was true. The seeds of distrust between Hashirama and Madara grew, until the two friends who once skipped stones together stood on opposite sides of a battlefield so massive it reshaped the land itself. The Valley of the End was carved into the earth that day, a permanent scar marking the end of their friendship. Madara was believed to have died there. He did not. He vanished into the shadows, waiting, planning, nursing a wound that never really healed. And the distrust he felt toward the village he helped found would echo for generations, eventually shaping the destiny of his entire clan. The Uchiha were never fully trusted by the village they helped build. Over the decades, that mistrust calcified into policy. The Uchiha were given a separate district. Many were assigned almost exclusively to the village police force, a position that looked respectable on paper, but isolated them from real influence in village leadership. They began to feel like outsiders in their own home. This resentment simmered for years, quiet, controlled, mostly unspoken, until a night when the nine-tailed fox attacked the village, and rumors began to spread that an Uchiha had been responsible for controlling the beast. The rumors were not entirely wrong, though the truth was more complicated than anyone in the village realized at the time. The suspicion toward the Uchiha deepened into something closer to fear. By the time Itachi Uchiha was a teenager, the clan elders had begun planning a coup. They were tired of being treated as a threat instead of a part of the village. They wanted power restored to their name. Itachi, secretly working as an informant for the village leadership, learned of the plan and was given an order that would haunt him for the rest of his short life. He was told that to prevent a civil war, one that could tear the entire village apart and leave it vulnerable to outside enemies, the coup needed to be stopped before it started, and the only way to stop it was for the clan itself to be eliminated. Itachi was 17 years old. He spent that final night walking through the streets of his own clan's district. The Uchiha symbol, the red and white fan, was painted on doors he had walked past his entire childhood. He moved silently from house to house, ending the lives of cousins, of elders, of people who had taught him to throw a kunai when he was barely old enough to hold one. His own parents were the last. His father, a proud and stern man who had led much of the coup planning, accepted his fate with something close to understanding. His mother simply asked him to take care of his little brother. Itachi promised he would. His brother Sasuke was spared, not by accident, but by Itachi's own choice, made in defiance of the orders he had been given. He could not bring himself to end his little brother's life. Instead, he gave Sasuke a different kind of burden. He told him to hate him, to grow strong from that hatred, to one day come and try to kill him. It was the cruelest kindness Itachi could think to give, a reason to live, wrapped inside a lie so painful that Sasuke would carry it for the rest of his childhood and well into his adult life. Itachi walked away from the only family he had left and let the world believe he was a monster. He never tried to clear his name. He let his little brother hate him completely because he believed that hatred, however painful, was better than grief without purpose. He died years later, having never told Sasuke the truth himself. It was a masked man within the criminal organization Itachi had infiltrated who eventually revealed it. Long after Itachi was gone, let us travel now to a different village, one built on the edge of the sea, where mist rolled endlessly across the water and hid the village's darkest tradition from outside eyes. Kirigakure, the hidden mist village, earned the nickname the Bloody Mist during a particularly dark era of its history. Most villages allowed their academy students to graduate after passing exams in the classroom and the training field. Kirigakure did something different. The final exam required students to fight each other. Not spar, fight, often to the death. Children who had trained side by side, who had eaten meals together, who had perhaps even called each other friends, were placed in an arena and told only one of them could leave as a ninja. Some students refused to fight and were killed regardless, deemed too weak for the village's needs. One boy who lived through that era was a quiet, gentle child who did not want to hurt anyone. He befriended a girl in his class, someone equally soft-spoken, equally out of place in a village built on cruelty. When the graduation exam came, the instructors paired them together, perhaps assuming that whichever one survived would carry the lesson with them for the rest of their life. The boy could not bring himself to fight her. She, in turn, could not bring herself to fight him. The instructors, growing impatient, threatened to kill them both if neither acted. In the end, it was the girl, the one closest to him, who chose to step forward and end her own participation in the fight, sacrificing herself so that he could live, and the cruelty of that day would not claim two lives instead of one. The boy grew up to become one of the most feared swordsmen the Mist Village ever produced. He carried that loss quietly for the rest of his life. He rarely spoke of it. He did not need to. It was written into every choice he made afterward, the way some grief settles permanently into the way a person moves through the world. The Bloody Mist era eventually ended when later generations chose to abolish that horrific graduation requirement. But for the ninja who survived it, the damage had already been carved into who they were. Let us move now to the sand, where a different kind of darkness took root, not from war, not from clan rivalry, but from politics and from a father's failure to separate duty from love. In Sunagakure, the hidden sand village, the leadership faced a difficult truth. Their village was falling behind the other great nations in military strength. They needed a weapon, something that could guarantee the village's survival in negotiations and in battle. The decision was made to seal one of the great tailed beasts into a child, creating what the villagers called a jinchuriki, a living vessel meant to serve as both protector and deterrent. The fourth Kazekage chose his own newborn son for this purpose. The boy was named Gara, and from the moment the seal was placed inside him, his life was no longer entirely his own. The beast sealed within him, a creature called Shukaku, was unstable and violent, and the process of containing it left Gara with a fragmented, lonely childhood. He could not sleep without risking the beast taking control. He grew up exhausted, isolated, surrounded by villagers who feared him more than they protected him. His own father, the man who had made the decision to turn his son into a weapon, grew increasingly afraid of what that weapon might become. There were assassination attempts on Gara's life, quietly authorized, meant to look like accidents or enemy attacks. Each failed attempt only deepened Gara's isolation, teaching him again and again that the people who were supposed to protect him saw him as something to be controlled or eliminated. He grew into a child who believed love was a fiction, invented by people who had never truly suffered. He fought only for himself because he had concluded, with the sour cold logic of someone who had been betrayed too many times, that no one else would ever fight for him. It would take years and the influence of people willing to see him as more than a weapon before Gara began to understand that his father's fear had been a failure, not a fact about him. But the scars of that childhood, the sleepless nights, the isolation, the quiet attempts on his life ordered by his own blood, never fully disappeared. They became part of the architecture of who he was. Let us return now to Konoha and to a different kind of darkness, one that lived not in a single dramatic massacre, but in the slow, grinding machinery of war itself. During the Third Great Ninja War, the village sent its children to the front lines far younger than anyone today would consider acceptable. Genin barely past their academy years found themselves face to face with enemy shinobi. In life or death combat, the war demanded numbers, and the village provided them regardless of age. It was during this war that a young, brilliant shinobi named Kakashi Hatake learned the harshest lessons of his life. He had been raised by his father's teachings to value his comrades above all else, only to watch his father, a man once celebrated as a hero, fall into disgrace and eventually take his own life, after a mission where he chose to save his teammates over completing his assignment. The village that once celebrated him turned cold once that choice cost them strategically. Kakashi, scarred by his father's fate, swallowed a different lesson instead. Mission first, comrade second. It was a philosophy built entirely from grief, and it would be tested in the worst possible way years later, when his own teammate Rin found herself captured by enemy forces and turned into a living weapon, implanted with a tailed beast meant to be released inside the walls of their own village. Rin understood what was at stake. She understood that if she returned home as she was, the destruction unleashed would be catastrophic. In a final act of devastating self-sacrifice, she placed herself directly in the path of an attack Kakashi was performing, choosing her own end over the chance that she might become a weapon used against everyone she loved. Kakashi did not know in that moment that she had made that choice deliberately. He believed for years that he had simply failed to stop in time. The truth that she had chosen this ending herself rather than become an instrument of destruction was a small, cold comfort he would not fully understand till much later in his life. Their teammate, watching from a distance, broken and grieving and unable to process what he had just witnessed, would carry his own version of that trauma forward, eventually becoming one of the most dangerous figures the ninja world would ever produce. Grief, left unspoken and untreated, has a way of traveling forward through time, shaping futures that the people who caused the original pain never intended. Let us drift now toward a different kind of darkness, the kind that hides not in war, but inside families who were never given the tools to heal. The Hyuga clan, proud bearers of the Byakugan, maintained a tradition that split the family into two branches. The main branch held authority and protection. The branch family carried a curse, quite literally, a seal placed on their foreheads that could be activated to cause immense pain or even death. A method of control meant to ensure loyalty and prevent the clan's most precious techniques from ever being stolen. When a foreign village once attempted to kidnap the heir of the main branch, hoping to steal the secrets of the Byakugan, a member of the branch family gave his life in the heir's place, both to protect the clan and to prevent a diplomatic disaster that could have led to war. He left behind a young son who grew up believing for years that his father's death had been a senseless waste rather than the sacrifice it truly was. That son grew into a shinobi defined almost entirely by resentment, carrying the weight of a curse seal on his forehead and a grudge in his heart. Toward cousins he had been taught from birth to serve and protect. It would take enormous effort and a confrontation that nearly cost lives before the truth of his father's sacrifice was finally understood, and before that resentment could begin slowly to heal. Some wounds in the ninja world were caused by war. Some were caused by enemies, but some of the deepest wounds were caused simply by traditions that families never questioned, rules passed down through generations because no one stopped to ask whether they needed to exist at all. As we move deeper into the night, let us speak quietly of a different war altogether, the kind no jutsu can fight and no sword can cut through. So many shinobi throughout this world's history were raised not by warm households, but by the cold logic of necessity. Orphans of war raised by villages that needed soldiers more than they needed to raise healthy, whole children. Some, like the founders of the criminal organization that would come to be feared throughout every nation, began with genuine dreams of peace, only to have those dreams curdled by loss and betrayal, till peace itself became something they tried to force onto the world through fear rather than understanding. The tragedy that repeats again and again throughout this world's darkest lore is not simply violence. It is the quiet, slow transformation of children who wanted something simple, safety, belonging, love, into adults who learned again and again that the world would not give it to them freely. Some found their way back toward connection eventually, others never did. It is worth remembering as your own eyes grow heavier and your own thoughts begin to slow that the wars and traditions and political machinery described tonight were not abstract forces. They were built by people generation after generation who often believed they were doing the right thing, protecting their villages, preserving their clans, ensuring survival, and in trying to protect what they loved, they often caused the very pain they were trying to prevent. There is no single villain in most of these stories, just people shaped by circumstances larger than themselves, making choices that rippled forward through decades, touching lives they would never even know about. The Uchiha Massacre, the Bloody Mist graduations, Gaara's lonely childhood, Kakashi's grief, the Hyuga curse seal. Each of these stories stands alone, and yet together they form something larger. A picture of a world that built itself on the backs of children who never asked to carry that weight. And yet, through all of it, something persisted, connection, the stubborn, quiet refusal of certain people to give up on each other, even when the world gave them every reason to. Sasuke, despite everything, found his way back. Gaara found people who saw him as more than a weapon. Kakashi, despite the grief that shaped him, eventually learned to value his comrades not as a burden, but as a reason to keep going. The darkness in this world was real. The pain was real, but it was never the only thing that was real. Let us slow down even further now and drift into one more region of this world's history, a story less about a single clan or village, and more about the price an entire generation paid for a war fought largely by people too young to understand what they were fighting for. The Second Great Ninja War swept across the nations during a time when the villages had only just begun forming the fragile alliances that would later define the shinobi world. It was during this war that 3 students from the Hidden Leaf village were placed under the guidance of a sensei who would go on to lead the entire village one day. Their names were Jiraiya, Tsunade, and Orochimaru, and the bond they formed during those years became one of the most enduring and ultimately one of the most tragic friendships in the ninja world's history. They were young, gifted, and utterly unprepared for what war would ask of them. Tsunade lost her younger brother in battle when he was barely old enough to be called a shinobi at all. His small body returned to the village wrapped in a way that haunted her for the rest of her life. Not long after, she lost the man she loved as well, a fellow shinobi who had promised to marry her once the fighting ended. The fighting never gave him the chance to keep that promise. Tsunade's grief calcified into something closer to fear. For years afterward, she could not stand the sight of blood without her hands beginning to shake uncontrollably, a devastating condition for someone whose specialty was medical ninjutsu, a field built entirely around healing wounds that bled. She walked away from the village for years, drowning her sorrow in gambling and drink, convinced that anyone she loved was destined to be taken from her. Orochimaru's path diverged in a quieter, more unsettling way. While his teammates mourned through grief and distance, he turned his pain inward toward an obsession with understanding death itself, hoping that if he could unlock its secrets, loss might never touch him or anyone he valued again. It was a noble impulse twisted slowly, year after year, into something monstrous. His experiments grew darker. His methods grew crueler. The line between protecting life and controlling it blurred until eventually it disappeared completely. He began performing forbidden experiments on captured shinobi from rival villages, then later, devastatingly, on children from his own village, hoping to engineer the perfect host for the techniques he was trying to preserve. When the truth of his experiments was finally discovered by the very teacher who had raised him like a son, he was forced to flee the village he had once been willing to die for. Jiraiya, the last of the three, carried his own grief differently. Where Tsunade fled into avoidance and Orochimaru fled into obsession, Jiraiya tried to carry the weight of both his friends' pain along with his own, becoming something of an emotional anchor for a friendship that was slowly falling apart around him. He never stopped believing that Orochimaru could be brought back from the path he had chosen. He never stopped hoping that Tsunade would heal enough to return home. In many ways, that hope defined the rest of his life, right up until his final mission years later, a mission undertaken specifically to gather intelligence that might help protect the next generation from a danger he suspected correctly would be even greater than anything his own generation had faced. 3 children who once trained together under cherry blossom trees, who once dreamed of a peaceful world, the way only the very young can dream, were pulled apart so completely by war and loss that one became a legendary healer haunted by blood. One became one of history's most reviled traitors, and one spent his life trying, and ultimately failing, to hold the other 2 together. Let us move now toward a different shadow, one cast not by an individual tragedy, but by an entire bloodline's relationship with power itself. The Senju clan, once celebrated as among the most powerful founding families of the shinobi world, carried within their bloodline an extraordinarily rare and dangerous ability, the power to manipulate wood itself, to summon ancient trees from nothing, to heal wounds through life force so potent it bordered on the supernatural. This power, called wood release, was so rare that for generations afterward, almost no one else in recorded history would ever awaken it naturally again. The very rarity of this power made the Senju clan a target for jealousy, manipulation, and eventually exploitation in ways the clan itself never fully anticipated. Decades after the clan's most famous members had passed away, a researcher obsessed with recreating their lost power began an experiment so dark that even speaking its details aloud feels heavy. He sought to recreate the genetic markers of the Senju bloodline using DNA harvested without consent, hoping to mass produce shinobi with the legendary power of wood release. The experiment succeeded only partially, and at a horrific cost. Most of the children created through this process did not survive infancy. Those who did survive often lived only a handful of years, their bodies unable to sustain the power forced into them. One child, in particular, created through this process, and given a name only much later in his short life, lived just long enough to understand dimly that he had never truly been alive in the way other children were. He had been built, engineered, a means to an end for a man who saw him not as a son, but as a successful trial. When this child's existence was finally discovered by shinobi from the hidden leaf, the horror of what had been done to him became impossible to ignore. He died not in battle, but simply because his small body had reached the absolute limit of what it could endure, a death caused not by an enemy, but by the ambition of someone who should have protected him. Stories like his rarely make it into the main retellings of this world's history. They live in the footnotes, the side missions, the quiet tragedies that never receive a grand battle or a dramatic reveal. But they are no less real for being quiet. In some ways, they are heavier, precisely because so few people ever stop to remember them. Let us turn now toward the story of an entire village's slow unraveling, one not caused by war with outsiders, but by the quiet, creeping rot of fear turned inward. In the years following a particularly devastating period of conflict, the leadership of one hidden village became consumed by paranoia, certain that hidden traitors and spies were embedded within their own ranks, certain that any sign of weakness or dissent could be the first crack in a wall that needed to remain absolutely solid in order to survive. What began as reasonable caution slowly transformed into something closer to a culture of suspicion, where shinobi were encouraged to report on each other, where loyalty was measured not by trust, but by the willingness to sacrifice anything, including relationships, including family, for the village's stability. Children raised within this culture learned early that emotional attachment was a liability. They learned to suppress grief, to suppress fear, to treat their own teammates as expendable resources rather than as people. An entire generation grew up believing that coldness was strength, and that warmth was something only the weak or the naive could afford to carry. It would take the actions of a very small number of individuals, people who chose, against everything they had been taught, to value connection over isolation, to slowly begin unwinding decades of that culture. Change, when it finally came, was neither fast nor easy. Trust, once broken across an entire generation, does not return overnight. It returns slowly, by conversation, by choice, each small act of vulnerability, a quiet rebellion against everything that generation had been taught to believe. It is easy, when looking back at the ninja world's history, to focus only on the great battles, the famous names, the legendary techniques, but so much of this world's true darkness lived in places far quieter than any battlefield. It lived in policies written by frightened leaders trying to protect what they loved. It lived in traditions passed down without anyone stopping to ask if they should continue. It lived in the silence between a parent and a child, in the things left unsaid because saying them felt too dangerous, too vulnerable, too much like weakness, in a world that did not seem to have room for softness. And yet, again and again, across every story we have walked through tonight, something quietly defiant kept surfacing. A father's hidden love beneath a harsh exterior, a teammate's silent sacrifice, a friend who refused to give up on someone the rest of the world had already written off. The world of Naruto is, in its bones, a story about inherited pain, but it is also, just as deeply, a story about the choice to break that inheritance, generation after generation, one person at a time. Perhaps that is the quiet thread running beneath all of tonight's stories. Pain travels forward easily. It always has. But so, sometimes, does the determination to make sure it travels no further than it has to. Let us linger a while longer in the dark, because there is one more story that deserves to be told quietly before we let the night carry us the rest of the way. It concerns the very weapons this world considered its most powerful and most feared assets, the tailed beasts, massive ancient creatures of pure chakra, each one distinct, each one carrying memories and a kind of consciousness most of the villages chose to ignore entirely. To the nations of this world, They were not living beings. They were resources, deterrents, trump cards to be held in reserve and unleashed only when absolutely necessary. Long before the villages existed, it is said that all 9 of these beasts were once a single entity, an enormous world-ending creature whose chakra was so vast and so dangerous that an ancient sage made the decision to divide it into 9 separate pieces, hoping that separation would make the power manageable, even survivable. He gave each piece a name. He spoke to each one as though they were his own children, hoping they would grow to understand kindness, connection, the value of working alongside humanity rather than being used by it. For a long while, that hope seemed almost possible, but as generations passed, and the villages that came after the sage forgot his original intentions, the beasts were no longer treated as beings with their own histories and feelings. They were hunted, captured, and sealed inside human hosts, often without any consideration for what that process would do to either party involved. The hosts, called Jinchuriki, paid an enormous personal price for carrying this power, shunned by their own villages, isolated from ordinary life, treated with simultaneous reverence and fear by the very people who depended on their strength for protection. Many Jinchuriki grew up in a state of profound loneliness that mirrored the isolation of the beast sealed within them. It was, in a strange and tragic way, a shared suffering. Both host and beast trapped together, neither one fully chosen for the role they had been given, both treated by the wider world as tools first and individuals a distant second. Some hosts found a way through that loneliness. Connection, when it came, however rare, however hard won, had a way of softening even the most volatile of these sealed beasts. A host who was loved, who was given genuine friendship and patience, often found that the creature within them responded in kind, slowly shifting from a force to be feared into something closer to a reluctant ally. But many hosts never received that chance. They lived and died treated as weapons, never once given the opportunity to be seen as anything else. It says something uncomfortable about this world, that its villages were so willing to sacrifice individual children, generation after generation, for the sake of collective security. It is the same uncomfortable truth that runs beneath nearly every story we have told tonight. Survival, when pursued without compassion, has a terrible way of costing exactly the kind of people it claims to be protecting. And yet, even within this story, threads of something gentler persisted. There were always a small number of people in every generation, sometimes a sibling, sometimes a teacher, sometimes simply a stranger willing to look past the fear and see a person instead of a weapon, who chose to extend kindness anyway. Their choices rarely changed entire villages overnight, but they changed individual lives. And sometimes, very occasionally, those individual lives grew up to change everything. This has always been the quiet undercurrent of the ninja world's darkest history. Systems built on fear, passed down through generations who rarely questioned them, causing real and lasting harm to the very people those systems claimed to protect. And alongside that darkness, almost always, a handful of individuals choosing, again and again, against the grain of everything they had been taught, to offer warmth instead of suspicion, patience instead of control, presence instead of isolation. It is a slow kind of healing, the kind that does not arrive in a single dramatic moment, but accumulates quietly over years, over generations. One small act of kindness layered on top of another, till eventually, almost imperceptibly, An entire world begins to shift. Before we let the night carry the rest of these stories away, let us pause on one final shadow, quieter than the rest, but no less heavy. It concerns the village hidden among the clouds, far to the north where the air ran thin, and the people built their lives high above the world below. Kumogakure, the hidden cloud village, prided itself on strength above almost everything else. Its shinobi trained under brutal conditions from a young age, taught that hesitation in battle was the surest path to death, both for themselves and for the comrades counting on them. This philosophy produced extraordinary warriors. It also produced a culture where vulnerability was treated almost as a moral failing. Children who cried were told to stop, not out of cruelty exactly, but out of a genuine, if misguided, belief that emotional softness would get them killed once they were old enough to be sent on real missions. Affection between parents and children was rarely expressed openly. Love was assumed, but rarely spoken aloud, as though saying it might somehow weaken its truth. One young shinobi raised in this environment carried an enormous tail beast sealed within him from a very young age, much like Gara far to the south. But where Gara's village treated him with fear and isolation, this young man's village made a different, though no less complicated choice. They embraced him publicly as a hero, a symbol of the village's strength, while privately offering him very little real emotional support. He was praised constantly. He was understood rarely. It took years and an unusually patient and unconventional mentor before this young man began to understand that strength and vulnerability were not actually opposites, that a person could be both a powerful protector and someone capable of softness, of humor, of deep loyalty, expressed openly rather than buried beneath performance. He became, eventually, one of the more emotionally open and supportive figures in his generation, almost in quiet defiance of everything his village had originally tried to teach him. His journey reminds us of something easy to forget. Amid all the tragedy this world's history holds, not every dark lesson passed down through a village or a clan was permanent. Some shinobi, through sheer stubbornness or unusual circumstance, or the influence of just one person willing to do things differently, managed to write a different ending for themselves than the one their upbringing seemed to guarantee. That, perhaps, is the quiet hope buried beneath every story we have walked through tonight. The wars were real. The traditions were often cruel. The grief passed down through generations left marks that never fully disappeared. But none of it was absolute. None of it was inescapable. Every generation produced individuals who looked at the patterns they inherited and chose, sometimes at great personal cost, to interrupt them. Let us stay a while longer in the dark, because the night is still young and there are more shadows worth walking through before we let sleep finally take you. Consider for a moment the village hidden among the stones far to the west, where the mountains were unforgiving, and the people who lived among them learned early that survival required a kind of hardness most other villages never needed to develop. Iwagakure, the hidden stone village, carried its own quiet legacy of loss, one shaped heavily by a single war that never fully left its collective memory. During the Third Great Ninja War, Iwagakure suffered one of the most devastating single losses any village experienced in that entire conflict, their forces advancing with confidence toward what should have been a routine victory were instead met by a single shinobi from the Hidden Leaf who altered the course of the battle so completely that the village's losses became almost unspeakable. He moved with such speed and precision that survivors swore they barely saw him before their comrades fell. He came to be known in the years that followed by a name spoken with genuine dread throughout the stone village: the Yellow Flash. The grief Iwagakure carried from that single battle shaped an entire generation's relationship with the Hidden Leaf village. Parents who lost siblings, children who lost fathers, entire clans who lost their most promising young shinobi in the span of a single afternoon. All of it settled into the village's collective memory as a wound that refused to fully close. Decades later, shinobi who had not even been born during that war still carried inherited resentment toward Konoha, taught from childhood that the Leaf Village's strength had been built, in some small but undeniable part, on the corpses of their own ancestors. This inherited grief found its way, eventually, into the heart of a young woman raised within Iwagakure's borders. She grew up hearing stories of the devastation her village endured, taught to see the Hidden Leaf as the architect of generational suffering, long before she ever had the chance to meet a single person from that village herself. Hatred, when taught early enough and reinforced consistently enough, has a way of feeling less like an emotion and more like a simple, unquestionable fact about the world. It was not until circumstances forced her into direct contact with shinobi from the very village she had been raised to despise that the simplicity of that inherited hatred began to complicate itself. She discovered, slowly and with no small amount of internal resistance, that the people she had been taught to hate were not the monsters of her village's stories, but simply people shaped by their own losses, their own fears, their own complicated histories. It did not erase the grief her village carried. It did not undo the loss her ancestors suffered. But it did, slowly, begin to soften the absoluteness of the hatred she had inherited, without ever choosing it herself. This is, perhaps, one of the quieter tragedies running beneath so much of this world's history. Grief, when left unexamined, has an extraordinary capacity to calcify into hatred that outlives the original loss by generations. Children inherit wars they never fought. They inherit grudges against people they have never met, carried forward simply because someone, somewhere up the family line, decided the hatred needed to be preserved rather than allowed to fade. And yet, again and again throughout this world's long and complicated history, individuals manage to interrupt that inheritance, not by forgetting the original loss, which would have been its own kind of dishonesty, but by refusing to let that loss define every relationship that came after it. It is, in many ways, one of the hardest forms of courage this world's history has to offer, harder, in some ways, than the courage required on any battlefield. Let us turn now to one final region of shadow before we let the rest of the night settle around you. The story of the smaller, lesser-known villages that existed in the spaces between the 5 great nations, villages without the protection of a major alliance, without the resources of a hidden village proper, simply trying to survive in a world built around them rather than for them. These smaller villages rarely appear in the grand retellings of this world's history. They had no famous kage, no legendary bloodlines, no battles significant enough to be remembered by the great nations surrounding them, and yet they existed, generation after generation, often caught directly in the path of conflicts they had no part in starting and no power to prevent. One such village, nestled in a valley between 2 warring great nations, learned early that survival meant something different for them than it meant for Konoha or Suna or any of the larger powers. They could not afford armies. They could not afford famous shinobi. What they could afford, the only currency truly available to them, was neutrality, offered carefully and consistently to whichever larger power happened to be passing through their borders at any given time. This neutrality came at a quiet, ongoing cost. The village's young people grew up understanding, often before they fully understood much else about the world, that their safety depended entirely on never taking a side, never expressing a genuine opinion about the wars unfolding around them, never allowing themselves the luxury of loyalty to anything beyond their own small community. It was a kind of survival that required constant, exhausting vigilance, the emotional equivalent of walking on broken glass for an entire lifetime. Children raised in villages like this often grew into adults who struggled, long after the immediate danger had passed, to trust any larger institution, any grand cause, any leader promising protection in exchange for loyalty. They had learned too early and too thoroughly that promises from the powerful rarely accounted for the safety of the small. It is easy, when looking at this world through the lens of its famous heroes and legendary battles, to forget how many people simply existed in the margins of these stories, trying to survive circumstances they never chose and could not control. Their stories rarely receive grand resolutions. Many of them simply persisted, generation after generation, doing the quiet, unglamorous work of keeping their communities alive through wars fought by people far more powerful than themselves. If there is a lesson buried within these smaller, quieter tragedies, it may be this: not every story in this world's history ends in transformation or healing. Some stories simply continue, generation after generation, people doing their best with circumstances that were never fair to begin with. And there is a kind of quiet dignity in that persistence, even when it never gets the recognition the more famous stories receive. Let us walk through one more shadow before the night finally carries you the rest of the way to sleep. The story of a man who many considered the wisest and most controlled shinobi of his generation, and the quiet darkness that lived beneath that calm exterior for almost his entire life. Within the Hidden Leaf village, there existed a small group of elite shinobi tasked with operations the village could never officially acknowledge. They worked outside the normal chain of command, answering instead to a single aging advisor who had convinced himself decades earlier that peace could only be protected through methods too harsh for the official village to ever sanction openly. This advisor recruited his operatives young, often from among the most talented and emotionally isolated children in the village, training them not just in combat, but in the deliberate suppression of every emotion that might interfere with absolute obedience. One of these operatives, a boy raised almost entirely within this shadow organization, rather than within a normal family structure, grew into one of the most quietly tragic figures the village ever produced. He had been taught from a young age that emotion was a weakness to be surgically removed, that loyalty to the village's safety mattered more than any individual relationship, that the right choice was always the choice that protected the greatest number of people, regardless of the personal cost to himself or to anyone standing in the way of that protection. This philosophy was tested most severely when he was assigned to monitor a clan whose growing dissatisfaction with the village leadership had begun to alarm the advisor who commanded him. He watched this clan for years, learning their routines, their relationships, their private grievances, slowly building the case that would eventually be used to justify one of the most devastating decisions in the village's history. He never once questioned whether the information he gathered would be used with restraint. He had been trained too thoroughly to question orders from above. When the order finally came, the order that would lead to the destruction of an entire clan from within, he carried it out with the same controlled efficiency he had been taught to apply to every mission of his career. It was only much later, years afterward, watching the consequences of that night ripple outward through the life of the one survivor left behind, that something in his carefully suppressed conscience began, quietly and reluctantly, to stir. He never spoke openly about his role in those events. The shadow organization he belonged to operated on absolute secrecy, and breaking that secrecy would have meant consequences far beyond his own life. Instead, he carried the weight privately, allowing it to surface only in small, almost imperceptible ways. A slight hesitation before certain missions, a quiet protectiveness toward the survivor he had once helped orphan, a willingness late in his life to make choices that finally prioritized protecting a single vulnerable person over blindly following the next order handed down to him. His story is a difficult one to sit with, precisely because it resists easy categorization. He was not purely a villain, shaped as he was by a childhood that gave him almost no alternative way of understanding the world. He was not purely a victim either, given the very real harm his choices caused to people who never had the chance to consent to the role they played in his village's hidden calculations. He existed, like so many figures in this world's history, in the uncomfortable space between victim and perpetrator, a space this world's stories return to again and again, refusing to offer the comfort of a clean moral line. It raises an uncomfortable question, worth sitting with quietly, here in the dark, as your own thoughts begin to slow. How much of what we call evil in this world's history was actually malice, and how much of it was simply children raised within systems designed to extinguish their empathy, doing exactly what those systems trained them to do. It does not excuse the harm. It does not make the grief of those affected any less real, but it complicates the simple story of villains and heroes that makes these tragedies easier to process at first glance. Let us close this particular thread with one final, quieter image. Late in his life, this same shadow operative found himself standing before the very advisor who had shaped his entire childhood, the man who had built an organization out of orphaned and emotionally isolated children and called it protection. For the first time in decades of absolute obedience, he hesitated. He had spent so many years executing decisions made by someone else that the simple act of questioning one, even silently, even just for a moment, represented a kind of personal rebellion, larger than any battle he had ever fought. That hesitation never fully blossomed into open defiance. The conditioning ran too deep, the years of training too thorough to undo so late, in a life built almost entirely around obedience. But the hesitation itself mattered. It was proof, however small, that even the most thoroughly conditioned among this world's shinobi retained some quiet, stubborn spark of the person they might have become under different circumstances. A person capable of questioning, of doubting, of eventually, perhaps, choosing differently. This is perhaps the final, quiet truth running beneath every story told tonight. This world built extraordinary systems for producing obedient, effective, emotionally suppressed warriors, generation after generation. And yet, again and again, something in individual human beings resisted that suppression, however quietly, however incompletely. Sparks of empathy that refused to be fully extinguished, moments of hesitation before following orders that felt wrong, small, private acts of protection offered to people the system had already written off as acceptable losses. None of these small acts of resistance undid the larger harm this world's history was built upon, but they mattered anyway, in the same way that a single candle matters in a large dark room. Not because it eliminates the darkness entirely, but because it proves that light is still possible, even in circumstances that seem designed to extinguish it completely. As your own thoughts continue to slow and the weight of the day finally begins to lift from your shoulders, let yourself hold on to that small, quiet truth. Whatever darkness exists in the world around you, however heavy the inherited patterns you carry forward, you remain capable of hesitation, of doubt, of choosing differently than the systems around you might expect. That capacity, however small it sometimes feels, is itself a kind of quiet, persistent light. There is still more of the night left to walk through, so let us continue a little further into a part of this world's history that unfolded not on any battlefield, but within the slow, patient cruelty of obsession. Among the most unsettling figures in this world's history was a shinobi whose brilliance was matched only by the depth of his willingness to disregard the value of other people's lives in pursuit of knowledge. He had once been celebrated as one of the most gifted students his generation had ever produced, a prodigy capable of mastering techniques that took most shinobi decades to even approach. But somewhere beneath that brilliance lived a terror so profound that it eventually consumed every other part of who he was. He was afraid, more than anything else in the world, of dying. This fear did not announce itself dramatically. It grew slowly, the way most quiet obsessions do, beginning as a simple scholarly curiosity about the nature of life and death, and deepening over years into something far darker. He began seeking out forbidden techniques, ones explicitly outlawed by every village that had ever encountered them, hoping to find a way to extend his own life indefinitely, to transfer his consciousness into new bodies before age or injury could claim the one he currently inhabited. The pursuit of this goal led him down a path that abandoned almost every ethical boundary his training had once instilled in him. He began experimenting on living subjects, first prisoners captured during wartime, individuals the village's official records simply listed as missing, their fates never fully investigated or acknowledged. As his research progressed and his methods grew more desperate, his subjects expanded to include children, some taken from orphanages with falsified paperwork, others simply abducted from villages, too small or too powerless to demand accountability from a shinobi of his reputation and skill. He told himself throughout all of this that his work served a greater purpose, that the secrets he uncovered about chakra, about the body's limits, about the boundary between life and death itself, would eventually benefit the wider shinobi world, far more than the individual lives lost along the way could possibly outweigh. It was the same justification echoed by so many of this world's darkest figures, the conviction that enough good intentions could somehow offset an unlimited amount of harm done to people who never consented to being sacrificed for someone else's vision of progress. One of his most disturbing techniques involved the method of extending his own life by forcibly transferring his consciousness into the body of another living person, effectively erasing that person's identity and replacing it with his own. He developed this technique over years of trial and error, refining it through countless failed attempts, each failure representing another life lost or irreparably damaged in service of his own survival. By the time the technique reached something resembling reliability, he had already used it on more than one occasion, taking new bodies the way some people might change clothing, treating each transition as simply the next necessary step in an unbroken continuation of his existence. His ultimate ambition, the goal toward which all of this horrific research was aimed, was to acquire a body and a set of eyes belonging to a particular bloodline he believed held the key to unlocking what he considered the ultimate technique in existence, a power capable of seeing through any illusion, predicting any attack, achieving a level of mastery over reality itself that no other shinobi had ever approached. He spent years cultivating a relationship with a young boy from this bloodline, specifically because he recognized in him the talent necessary to eventually develop the eyes he coveted, patiently mentoring him, training him, offering him knowledge and power in exchange for trust, all while quietly waiting for the moment when that young man's eyes would mature enough to be worth taking. It is a particularly devastating kind of darkness, this patient, decades-long cultivation of a relationship purely for the purpose of eventual betrayal. The young man in question never fully knew for years that the mentor offering him guidance and power was simultaneously counting down toward the day he intended to discard him entirely, his body and his eyes reduced to nothing more than the next vessel in an endless chain of theft disguised as continuity. When the truth eventually surfaced, when this young man understood fully what his mentor had been planning for him the entire time, the betrayal cut deeper than almost any other in this world's long history of broken trust. It was not simply violence, it was years of carefully constructed intimacy, weaponized patience, deployed specifically to make an eventual act of profound violation feel, for as long as possible, like genuine care. This story offers no comfortable resolution, no clean lesson to soften its edges before we move forward into the rest of the night. Some darkness in this world's history simply exists as a warning, a reminder that intelligence and ambition, when stripped of any genuine regard for other people's autonomy, can produce horrors far more calculated and far more patient than any battlefield rage ever could. The fear of death, when left completely unchecked by any ethical boundary, proved capable of justifying almost unlimited harm to people who had done nothing except exist within reach of someone powerful enough to take what he wanted from them. Let us move now toward a gentler, though still heavy, corner of this world's history, the story of an entire clan whose downfall came not from war or betrayal, but from the quiet, accumulating weight of being treated as a tool rather than as people, generation after generation, till the clan itself simply could not continue. This particular clan specialized in a rare and demanding technique requiring the user to bind their own life force to powerful puppets, extending their reach and their lethality far beyond what an ordinary shinobi's body alone could achieve. The technique was extraordinarily effective in battle, and for that reason, the clan's services were in constant demand by villages seeking an edge in the endless conflicts that defined this world's earlier eras. But the technique came with a hidden cost that the clan's leadership rarely discussed openly. even among themselves. Each use of their most powerful jutsu drew directly from the user's own lifespan, trading years of their existence for moments of overwhelming battlefield strength. Over generations, the clan's elders developed an unspoken culture around this cost, training their children from a young age to view their own shortened lifespans as a simple, unquestionable fact of their heritage, something to be accepted with quiet pride rather than mourned or resisted. Children born into this clan grew up understanding, often before they fully grasped much else about the world, that their lives would likely be shorter than those of ordinary people, that this sacrifice was simply the price of carrying their family's techniques forward, and that questioning this arrangement was itself a kind of disloyalty to everyone who had come before them and made the same sacrifice without complaint. One young woman raised within this clan began to quietly question this inheritance in a way her elders found deeply unsettling. She had watched her own older siblings age rapidly after years of battlefield deployment, their bodies bearing the visible toll of techniques that had kept the clan valuable and feared for generations. She began to wonder, in private, whether the village's gratitude for her clan's sacrifice was genuine, or whether it was simply convenient, a relationship structured so that her clan bore all the cost, while the village reaped all the benefit, with very little genuine reciprocity offered in return. Her questioning was not well received. The clan's elders, having built their entire identity and sense of purpose around this particular sacrifice, interpreted her doubt as a rejection of everything that made their family meaningful. She found herself increasingly isolated within her own clan, treated with suspicion by the very people who should have understood her concerns most intimately, simply because she had dared to ask whether the cost they all paid was truly necessary, or whether it had simply become tradition for tradition's sake, perpetuated long after anyone had stopped to ask if a different path might exist. It took her years, working largely alone and often in secret, to develop modifications to her clan's traditional techniques that reduced the lifespan cost significantly without sacrificing the battlefield effectiveness that had always justified the sacrifice in the first place. Her research was initially dismissed by the clan's older generation, who viewed any deviation from established tradition with deep suspicion. It was only after younger clan members began quietly adopting her modified techniques and the village itself began to notice the change in outcomes that her work finally received the recognition it deserved. Her story offers a different kind of lesson than many of the others we have walked through tonight, a reminder that sometimes the most important act of resistance against inherited harm is not dramatic defiance, but patient, careful, often lonely work, questioning assumptions that everyone around you treats as simply the unchangeable nature of things, until eventually, slowly, the unchangeable proves itself capable of changing after all. It is worth sitting with for a moment how many traditions across this world's many villages and clans persisted not because they were truly necessary, but simply because no one had yet found the courage, or the patience, or the freedom from social pressure to question them seriously enough to imagine an alternative. Tradition, this world's history, reminds us again and again, is not the same thing as necessity. Sometimes the two overlap, but often the comfort of doing things the way they have always been done obscures the simple fact that a better way was possible all along, waiting only for someone willing to risk the isolation of asking why. As the night settles fully around you now, let these stories rest quietly in the back of your mind, not as nightmares, but as reminders that even in worlds built on war and tradition and grief, something gentler can still grow. That the children who survive these tragedies often became the very people who changed the world for the better. Rest now, let the weight of the day fall away. The stories have been told, the shadows have been walked through, and on the other side of all that darkness, there is still morning waiting. Sleep well,